The ferry came back under me wrong. You learn the weight of a run after a while. The pull into the slip, the way the deck settles, the sound the ramp chains make before you even touch them. This one felt lighter than when it had left, and by then I already knew better than to talk myself out of that. The dock lights were weak and yellow and barely reached past the wet planks. Everything past that was black water. I kept the ramp up. I killed the engine and watched the clock on the panel, because that was the rule. 1 full minute. No shortcuts. We'd gotten through worse by doing it exactly that way. About halfway in, I heard footsteps move across the deck above me. Slow, solid, coming forward before anybody should have been able to step off. I remember thinking, back at the start of that first shift, that if I just did everything right, that would be enough. I got into eastern North Carolina 3 days after the last company on my list stopped returning my calls. By then, I'd already heard every polite version of no there was. Some places blamed insurance. Some said the job was already filled. One man said they were looking for a cleaner fit and left it there. Nobody had to say what they meant. Once your name gets tied to an incident report involving a vehicle over the side, it sticks. It doesn't matter that nobody died. It doesn't matter that the weather was bad, that the ramp lights were throwing glare, that I was a few seconds early instead of a full move too soon. A family still went into the water in an SUV, and the father spent long enough in a hospital bed for the rest of it to stop mattering. The only reason I was even down in Hyde County was because one of the county men I'd talked to knew somebody who knew somebody near Swan Quarter. Small landing, night work, thin staffing, the kind of job people took because they needed it, not because they wanted it. Back then, that was enough for me. The road out there cut through long stretches of marsh with drainage ditches on both sides and hardly any houses left lit after dark. The farther I drove, the flatter everything got. I passed a church, a bait stand already closed up for the night, and then almost nothing. Off to my right, past the dark reeds and low black trees, there were spots where I could tell the land had opened toward Pamlico Sound, even when I couldn't see the water cleanly. The air had that cold, salt-flat smell to it. The landing sat at the end of a narrow road that looked like it had been patched more times than repaved. Small booth, single barrier arm, a squat little control shed with chipped paint and a weak light over the door that buzzed louder than it shined. Beyond that was the ramp and the ferry itself, tied in and rocking just enough to remind you this wasn't some still inland channel. The deck lights were on, but they didn't reach far. They lit the wet steel, the loading lane, part of the railing, and then the dark just took the rest. I parked and stepped out into air that smelled like brine, old fuel, and damp wood. The boards under my boots had that slick feel dock planks get after dark, when everything starts pulling moisture out of the air. Somewhere below the landing, I could hear water pushing slow against the pilings. Walter was waiting near the booth with a clipboard tucked under one arm. He looked like exactly what he was. Not a manager, not a county office guy. Just an older ferry hand in a work jacket that had been around longer than I had, shoulders bent a little from weather and years of climbing in and out of places like this. He had the kind of face you trust faster than you mean to because it looks worn in by real shift. "You're Daniel?" Walter said. I told him I was. Sadie was leaning near the booth window with a styrofoam cup in one hand and her other hand in her jacket pocket. She looked local in the way some people do without trying, not because of how she dressed, really. More because she stood there like she already knew what every light, cable, and sound meant. She watched the lane before she watched me. Sadie didn't look at me when she said it. "Most folks around here just call it the back ferry." The way she said it made it clear that wasn't what the county probably had written on anything official. It was just what people around there called it, the same way small places end up with names that stick harder than the real ones. I didn't ask what the sign said during the day. It didn't seem important. Walter went over my start paperwork in about 30 seconds and then moved straight into work talk, which I appreciated. Ramp controls, slip alignment, lane capacity, fuel log, crossing times. He talked like a man who assumed you either understood the job or you didn't belong near it. I liked that. I'd spent too long trying to claw my way back into any version of this work to be bothered by rough edges. I wasn't superstitious, never had been. Ferries are steel, timing, load, weather, visibility, and people making clean decisions under pressure. That was how I'd always looked at it. Whatever the county called that little run out near Swan Quarter, whatever the locals called it after dark, it was still a working landing on the edge of the Sound, smaller than what I was used to, older, more remote, but still a system. And standing there with the water black beyond the ramp and the deck lights buzzing over the slip, that was all I thought it was. An old ferry landing out in the marsh. Small, strange, still just a ferry landing. Walter spent the first part of the shift showing me the landing the same way men in that kind of work usually do, which was to say, he didn't waste words on anything he thought I should already understand. He pointed, named, checked whether I was looking at the right thing, and moved on. The booth sat just off the lane with one narrow ticket window facing the approach. Most of the payment went through there before a vehicle ever got near the ramp. The barrier arm was old, but still responsive, with a switch inside the booth and a second cutoff at the panel by the shed in case anything jammed. Past that was the boarding lane itself, just wide enough for a clean single line, with white paint that had worn thin in places from tires and salt air. The ramp dropped from the landing onto the ferry deck at a slight angle that made more sense once Walter explained how the tide changed the fit over the course of the night. He showed me the watermarks on one of the pilings first. Not the official markers, just old stains and scraped lines in the wood that he'd clearly been reading longer than I'd been there. At higher water, the approach sat easier. At lower water, the angle changed, and you had to watch how the tires came over the lip, especially with pickups and heavier loads. He pointed at the chain housing, the hinge points, and the deck edge like he expected me to remember all of it in one pass. Walter tapped the clipboard. Out here, you check twice before you move anything. That, at least, sounded like common sense. He took me through the control panel next. Ramp controls, deck light switches, floodlights, engine cutoff, radio base. There was a small brass bell mounted near the inside corner of the booth, dull from years of salt air and fingers. I assumed at first it was just there because it always had been, some leftover from before the radio system got updated, but Walter touched it like it still mattered. Right beside it sat the logbook, thick and warped a little along the edges from years of damp air, with a pen clipped to the cover by a piece of faded tape. The pages were filled with crossing times, maintenance notes, lane counts, weather shorthand, and the kind of quick handwriting people use when they don't expect anyone outside the job to ever read it. I'd worked cleaner lines than that one, bigger slips, better lighting, better staffing, places where the lane markings were fresh and the chain housings didn't rust at the corners and the office smell was coffee, printer paper, and solvent instead of damp plywood and old engine grease. But I also knew better than to mistake rough for broken. Plenty of operations looked clean and still fell apart because people got lazy. Plenty of ugly ones kept moving because the process was tight and the crew respected it. That was still how I thought then. If the process was good enough, and if the people followed it, the rest could be managed. Sadie stayed mostly around the booth while Walter walked me through the controls, and I started seeing her pattern before I was fully aware I was doing it. Every time headlights came down the road, or someone pulled into the waiting area, or a truck rolled up too fast before braking at the barrier, she looked at the lane first. Distance, position, tires. Then she looked at the person, not the other way around. It was subtle enough that I probably wouldn't have noticed it if I hadn't spent so many years reading approach behavior myself. When there was no traffic, she wiped down the inside edge of the window, checked the receipt roll, tested the radio twice without comment, and stepped out once to look at the ramp angle with her hands in her jacket pockets. She never made any of it look dramatic, just practiced, like she'd learned that little things turned into bigger things if you let them slide on nights. Walter's clipboard had more than the printed forms clipped to it. He had small handwritten notes in the margins of everything. A time circled. A reminder to check the lower hinge after hard weather. A line about the floodlights sticking if the switch got thrown too fast. One note I caught upside down looked like nothing more than "Watch fog after 1 a.m." with the word "watch" pressed hard enough to dent the paper. I didn't think much of it then. Every old hand has their own shorthand. Every night operator ends up with a set of habits they trust more than the official manual. The ferry itself wasn't large, but it felt solid when it was tied in. I could hear the low knock of water under the hull and the occasional shift of weight through the lines. The deck lights buzzed overhead and threw a flat yellow wash across the steel, but they didn't do much for the water beyond the rail. Once you got past the lit edge of the landing, Pamlico Sound turned into black space with a little movement in it. The beam just died out there. On clear nights, Walter told me, you could make out more of the line across the water. On damp nights, especially when the fog started sitting low, you worked mostly by known distances and sound. That was the part I liked, honestly. Not the isolation exactly, but the work of it. The idea that if you knew your lane, your timing, your panel, your load, and your water, then you could keep things moving. Small route or not, county run or not, that part still made sense to me. Sadie came back inside the booth with her cup and looked past me toward the lane before checking the clock over the window. "Walter's got his way of doing nights," Sadie said. I glanced at him, expecting some kind of joke out of her, but she'd already gone back to checking the approach road. Walter didn't react. He was writing something else down on the clipboard, calm as ever. I listened to the radio crackle once, then go quiet again. I watched the barrier arm lift and lower clean. I watched Walter note the crossing times in the logbook, even when there wasn't much traffic to justify the care he put into it. I watched Sadie look at the lane before she looked at the people in it. I smelled wet wood, diesel, cold metal, old coffee. I heard lines creak, ramp chains settle, water taps slow under the boards. It was a small place, an aging place, a place with more habits than explanations. But by the end of that first hour, it still felt like something I understood. Not every piece of it, maybe, but the structure of it. The kind of place that stayed running because the people on it had learned the exact shape of every problem that usually came through after dark. Walter waited until he'd already shown me the landing twice. That was the part I remembered later. He didn't start with any of it. He didn't slide into it with a story. He didn't test me first to see if I was the kind of man who'd laugh at him. He walked me through the shift the same way he walked me through the panel, the ramp angle, the lane, the tide marks, the radio. Straight, practical, like all of it belonged to the same job. It wasn't until we were back inside the booth, with the heater humming low under the window and the weak light over the lane throwing a dull reflection on the glass, that he opened the clipboard again and pulled out an older folded sheet from behind the printed forms. The paper looked different from the rest of the packet. Older, softer at the folds, not dirty exactly, just handled a lot. He flattened it once against the counter with the side of his hand. Walter kept his eyes on the water. These aren't county rules, they're night rules. I looked at the page, then at him. He didn't look like a man trying to scare me. That mattered. I'd met enough people in this line of work who liked to pass down stories just to see if the new guy would bite. Walter didn't have that in him. He had the look of somebody going over a checklist that had outlasted the original paperwork. The first line on the sheet was shorter than I expected. Not much explanation. Just a direct instruction written the way people write things down when they've already repeated them too many times out loud. If someone shows up on foot after the second to last crossing, look at their shoes before you look at their face. If the planks are wet and their shoes are dry, do not speak to them. Ring the boarding bell once and keep your eyes on the water until they leave. I read that twice. A part of me wanted to ask why shoes? Why not the hands, the clothes, the timing, anything else that would at least sound like a judgment call based on actual work? But I didn't. Not yet. I'd worked long enough around old operators to know that if you interrupted too early, you usually got less, not more. Walter just moved to the next one. If a car pulls up after midnight and stops short of the ticket booth with its headlights off, do not wave it forward. Wait. If the driver wants the crossing, they'll roll down the window before you ask. If the window stays up, send the ferry across empty. That one sounded a little closer to something I could almost justify. A vehicle hanging back with the lights off after midnight was suspicious anywhere. Walter still didn't explain it. He was just reading it over the same way he might have read out a fuel check or a maintenance note. I looked up at Sadie then, maybe expecting a grin from her, something that would tell me this was local nonsense I was supposed to humor for a week until they decided they liked me. She was standing by the window with her cup in both hands, watching the lane. Sadie let that sit there. Most nights that's enough. Most nights. That was a strange way to put it, but she said it without drama. No smile, no heavy look, just like she was confirming the crossing schedule. Walter kept going. On nights when the fog sits low over the water, you may hear someone knocking from underneath the loading ramp. Do not crouch down. Do not shine your flashlight below the boards. Start the deck floodlights and count to 10 out loud. If the knocking is still there after that, cancel the trip. That one I did look up from. Not because it sounded supernatural. I wasn't there yet. It was because it sounded too specific not to have happened before. The kind of instruction nobody writes unless they've already learned they need to. I could have told myself it was about sound carrying weird over the water, loose hardware, wave action under the ramp, some trick of fog and current and damp boards. Maybe that was even what I believed at the time. I just remember thinking the count to 10 part was odd. Odd enough that it stayed with me. Walter didn't pause for questions. He kept his finger on the sheet and went on to the fourth. If a passenger says they missed the last crossing, check the logbook before you answer. If the name they give is already written on that page, do not let them board, even if you know you did not write it. Close the book and tell them the ferry is out of service. That was the first one that got under my skin a little. Not enough to scare me, just enough to annoy the part of my brain that liked work to stay in its lane. A logbook is a record. It's times, notes, traffic count, maintenance. It's not supposed to be part of a decision tree like that, unless there's some boring procedural reason behind it. Duplicate records, pre-entered manifests, something a man can point to. But Walter gave me nothing with it. No reason, no story, no old incident, just the line. And then the last one. If the ferry comes back lighter than it left, do not drop the ramp right away. Keep it raised, kill the engine, and wait for 1 full minute. If you hear footsteps crossing the deck before you lower it, back away from the controls and let the minute finish. I read that one slower than the others. Not because I understood it. I didn't. But because that was the first time I got the feeling there was some shape to all of them together. Not a superstition exactly. Not random habits either. They all had the same tone. They all assumed one thing had already happened and that my job, or Sadie's job, was to answer it in exactly one way. I handed the sheet back, then took it again when Walter didn't move for it. He watched me for a second. Not hard, just enough to make sure I was actually taking it in. You don't have to like them, he said. You just follow them. That was probably the right thing to say to me, because I didn't like them. Not as written. They rubbed against every part of me that wanted a procedure to have a reason attached to it. But I also knew the difference between a man inventing theater and a man passing along habits that had kept a place running longer than it should have. So I read them again. This time, I sorted them the way I'd sort any shift information. Who makes first contact? Who checks what? Who holds final call? Rule 1 and Rule 2 started with the lane and the booth, which meant Sadie would see those first. Rule 3 and Rule 5 centered on the ramp, lights, panel, and whether the trip moved or didn't, which made them mine in the end. Rule 4 sat in the middle with the logbook, close enough to both of us that it belonged to the shift, not the person. That part mattered to me. If it had sounded like some private ritual Walter did for his own comfort, I probably would have written it off right there. But it didn't. It sounded shared, built into how the night ran. Sadie didn't argue with any of it. She didn't nod like a believer either. She just stood there like somebody who had already stopped needing explanations. I folded the paper once and slid it back into the packet. I still thought there had to be a plain reason under it all. Maybe not a good one. Maybe not one anybody bothered writing down anymore. But a reason. A local problem. A run of bad incidents. One old operator's habits that had stuck around because nobody wanted to break what seemed to work. That was how I made room for it in my head. It was just a small ferry landing out near the Sound, underlit and far enough off the main road that routine probably mattered more than the official handbook ever accounted for. Places like that grow their own ways of doing things. That was normal. I'd seen versions of that before. Even then, though, I could feel the air in the booth had changed a little. Not enough to call it fear, just enough to make the place feel more closed in than it had an hour earlier. The lane outside was empty. The weak light buzzed over the damp boards. The bell sat on the counter. The logbook stayed shut beside it. Walter slid the old folded sheet back behind the forms, like it belonged there more than the county papers did. And for the first time that night, I had the feeling there were parts of that landing that were being held together by something other than steel and habit, even if I still would have told you habit was all it was. The first half of the shift stayed quiet enough that I started feeling a little stupid for how seriously I'd taken that folded sheet. Traffic was light. A pickup with 2 coolers in the bed came through around 10:40 p.m. A county truck crossed a little after 11 p.m. Then nothing for long enough that the heater in the booth started sounding louder than the radio. Walter had already headed out, leaving the rest of the shift to me and Sadie. By then, I knew where everything was. Barrier switch, bell, floodlights, logbook, ramp controls. The lane outside looked the same every time I checked it. Wet boards, weak light, black water past the slip. Around 12:20 a.m., I stepped out of the booth to look at the ramp angle again. The tide had eased lower since the start of the shift, not enough to be a problem, but enough that I wanted the feel of it in my head before the next vehicle came in. That was still how I worked. If I knew the panel, the water, the lane, and the timing, then I could keep ahead of whatever the night wanted to hand me. I heard the tires before I saw the car. Not fast, not aggressive, just a slow roll coming down the road toward the landing. I turned and saw it come into the wash of the outer light, dark-colored, maybe a sedan, maybe something a little bigger. Hard to tell with the angle and the way the light died before the lane really opened up. What I noticed first was that the headlights were off. The car kept moving until it reached a point just short of the booth, then stopped there. Not at the window, not at the barrier, just short of both. I stood there for a second, waiting for the lights to come on. They didn't. The windshield gave me nothing, just a dull black reflection with a little color from the booth light caught in it. My first instinct was old habit. Lift a hand, wave them forward, get them where I could see the driver clean and ask the usual questions through the window. Crossing or not, number of passengers, any special load, just move the night along. Sadie was already looking past me at the lane. Sadie kept her eyes on the lane. Don't wave it in. I stopped with my hand half raised. The way she said it got my attention more than the words did. No panic, no edge, just flat certainty, like she was telling me not to hit the wrong switch. I let my hand drop and kept looking at the car. It stayed there, engine on. No lights, no movement that I could see behind the windshield. I don't know how long we stood like that before I looked at her. Then what am I waiting for? I asked. She didn't look at me. The window. That was it. No extra explanation. No look that said I'd understand later. She just kept her eyes on the lane, and I stayed where I was. A few things ran through my head while we waited. Driver's drunk, driver's lost. Driver doesn't want the cameras near the booth getting a better shot of the plate. Driver's screwing around for no reason because it's after midnight and there's nobody else out there. All of those were better explanations than anything else, and I grabbed at them because they were normal. The problem was none of them fit the stillness of it. Most people in a car will do something. Inch forward, crack the window, flash the lights, lean a shoulder, let you see a hand move on the wheel. This one did none of that. It just held there in the dark like it had reached the exact point it meant to reach and was waiting on us instead. I could feel the cold through my jacket by then. I remember the smell of the water and the old fuel coming off the slip. I remember the hum of the booth light behind me and the faint ticking from the engine in the car carrying farther than it should have over the wet boards. After maybe another 20 seconds, maybe 30, I stepped back into the booth and checked the clock. No reason, really. Just something to do with my hands. Sadie stayed at the window. The window on the car never came down. I waited longer than I would have anywhere else, then longer than I was comfortable waiting. Finally, I made the call. I left the barrier where it was, logged the crossing as empty, and took the ferry over without boarding the car. Even then, I still expected the driver to flash the lights or lean on the horn once they realized I was leaving them there. Nothing. The crossing itself took only a few minutes, and the whole time I kept replaying it in my head, trying to decide whether I'd just followed one of Walter's night rules or let a local habit make me look like an idiot. The Sound was black on both sides, and the deck lights gave me the same tight little world of steel and rail they always did. The ferry felt normal under me. Engine vibration, line of travel, small corrections through the slip. Normal enough that I started feeling a little embarrassed by how much weight I'd given the thing in the lane. By the time I brought the ferry back in, I'd halfway decided the car had probably turned around and left once it realized I wasn't going to bring it forward. I tied in, stepped off, and looked up the lane. It was empty. No taillights on the road, no sound of gravel, no turnaround marks that I could see in the weak light near the shoulder. Just wet pavement, the barrier, the booth, and the road running back into the dark. I stood there longer than I needed to, not scared exactly, more thrown off than that. I told myself a driver could back out quiet if they took their time. I told myself I'd been on the water for a few minutes, and a lot can change in a few minutes. I told myself all the obvious things because they were obvious, and because I wanted them to be enough. Sadie didn't say I told you so. She didn't say much at all. She just marked something in the booth and went back to watching the road like that was all any of it had been. The second thing happened closer to the last part of the shift. Not a car this time, a person on foot. I saw the figure first at the edge of the light, where the lane met the boards near the landing, moving slow, hands down, no bag, no jacket hood, even though the air had gotten colder. My first instinct was to lift my eyes and get a look at the face. Sadie beat me to it without saying a word. She looked down first. I caught it half a beat later and did the same. The boards out there were damp. They'd been damp all night. I could see the shine on them under the weak light. The shoes were dry. Not mostly dry. Dry enough that they looked wrong sitting on that wet wood. Sadie reached over, rang the bell once, and then leaned one hand against the counter and looked out toward the black water beside the slip instead of at the person. So I did the same. Nobody came closer. Nobody called out. I could hear little things instead. Water hitting the pilings, a chain settling somewhere on the ferry, my own breathing sounding louder than it should have in that small booth. Then the shape at the edge of the landing was gone. I waited another few seconds before I looked back. There was nothing there. That was the point where something shifted for me, not all the way into belief. I wasn't there, but I was past the point of brushing the rules off as some old man's private nonsense. I'd followed one because Sadie told me to, and the result had bothered me more than if I'd just waved the car forward and found some drunk local behind the wheel. Then I'd followed another one without really choosing to, and the night had seemed to close back up around us like it was satisfied we'd done what it wanted. I still thought there had to be reasons under it, real ones, local ones, things I just hadn't learned yet. But by the end of that first night, I'd stopped thinking of Walter's rules as harmless quirks. They were strange, they were specific, and whether I understood them or not, they had started to feel functional. I drove back out there the second night paying attention to different things. The road was the same, low marsh on both sides, dark stretches where the land dropped away enough that you could feel Pamlico Sound off to your right before you ever saw open water. The same little landing at the end of it, with the weak light over the shed and the booth window reflecting more than it let you see through. But I didn't come in looking at that place like it was just another small county run anymore. I came in remembering where Walter kept the folded sheet. I came in noticing the lane before I noticed the booth, the barrier before the booth light, the bell before the heater hum, the logbook before the clipboard. I checked the ramp angle as soon as I got there, then the watermark on the piling, then the panel. I tested the radio twice without thinking about why. I looked at the floodlight switches long enough to make sure I could find them fast without looking down if I had to. That was the difference. The first night I'd learned the place. The second night I was already building a system in my head for it. I still wasn't calling it belief. I told myself it was just what good operators do after a strange first shift. You adapt to the route you're on. You note the weak spots. You tighten up. That was all. Sadie was already there when I pulled in. Same jacket, same styrofoam cup, same habit of looking out at the lane before she looked at me. She gave me a small nod and went back to the road. No questions about whether I'd slept, no joke about whether I still wanted the job. I appreciated that. Some people want to talk too much after a shift that leaves a mark on them. Sadie wasn't one of those people. The fog came in earlier that night, not thick at first, just a low pale drag over the black water off the slip, sitting under the lights instead of inside them. It didn't cover the landing, it just made the edge of the water harder to read. The deck lights still lit the steel. The lane still showed wet under the weak yellow bulbs. But once you looked past the end of the ramp, the world turned flatter and meaner. The black water lost what little shape it had. I checked the logbook before the first crossing because I wanted to get ahead of the nerves from the night before. Time out, time in, weather, light traffic, wind low, visibility fair to poor over open water. I wrote cleaner than Walter did, but not by much. The page still looked like a work page by the time I closed it. Nothing strange happened on the first run, or at least nothing I could point to cleanly. A pickup came through with crab pots stacked in the bed and one tail light half out. An older couple in a sedan crossed without saying much. The ferry ran like a ferry, engine vibration through the deck, ramp chains settling, tires rolling over wet steel, bell, barrier, lights, logbook, small steps done in the same order, then done again. And that, more than anything, started giving me confidence. I'd spent a long time after the accident feeling like every mistake was waiting one beat behind me. Every rushed motion, every call made too early, every assumption. Once you've watched a vehicle go where it should never go, you stop trusting yourself the same way. Or I did. I started checking things twice and still hearing my own judgment like it belonged to somebody I didn't fully trust anymore. That landing was the first place since then where a system, even a strange one, felt like it might hold if I respected it. The second run came back in under more fog, not enough to shut anything down, not even close, but enough that the floodlights reflected harder off the damp air, and enough that the water under the ramp sounded closer than it had earlier. That was something I noticed before I understood why I noticed it. The slip had its own sounds, hinge noise, chain rattle, small wave slap under the boards, the low idle of the engine when I brought us in. I was still sorting those sounds into categories in my head when I heard something that didn't fit any of them. 3 knocks. Not loud, not metallic exactly either. More like something hitting wood from underneath. Slow enough to count, close enough that I felt it in my shoulders before I really placed it. I took one step toward the edge of the ramp on instinct. That was all it took. My body did what bodies do. You hear a sound under something, you want to look under it. Sadie heard it first. Floodlights. That stopped me. I didn't argue, didn't ask if she was sure. I turned, hit the switch, and the deck floodlights came up all at once, bleaching the ramp, the steel, the wet planks, and the rail in a colder, harsher wash than the regular deck lights gave. The reflection off the damp metal was ugly and bright. It flattened everything right in front of us and still gave us almost nothing below the level of the boards. The knocking came again. I knew the rule. I could hear Walter's voice in my head even though he wasn't there. Do not crouch down. Do not shine your flashlight below the boards. Start the deck floodlights and count to 10 out loud. So that was what I did. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I kept my eyes level, not down, not under, straight ahead over the lit part of the ramp where the steel met black space. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. The knocking stopped before I finished the count, but I finished it anyway. And then there was nothing, not the sound fading off, not another hit farther away, just nothing. Water under the landing, a line shifting against a cleat, my own voice gone out of the air. That was it. For a second I stayed exactly where I was, one hand still near the switch panel. Then I looked at Sadie. I hit the switch. You've done this before? She kept her eyes off the ramp. Walter did. That was answer enough, not because it explained anything, it didn't, but because it told me the important part. The rule had not been written for no reason, and what had just happened was not new enough to surprise her. I waited longer than I needed to before moving again. Then I brought the ferry all the way in, held the ramp where it needed to be, and finished the crossing. Nothing else on that run went wrong. That mattered. If something had jumped immediately after, if another sound had started, if the lane had filled with something I couldn't account for, I might have dismissed the whole thing as random noise and my own nerves making a pattern out of it. But the clean stop was exactly what made it feel real. The rule said, do this. I did it. The thing stopped. You can do a lot with that if you're a man like I was then. You can build a whole sense of safety out of one event like that, not because you're naive, because procedure is a kind of relief when you've spent long enough knowing what happens without it. Later that same shift, I caught myself doing something I hadn't done the night before. A truck rolled down the road toward the landing a little too slow, not wrong exactly, just uncertain. Before it even reached the booth, I checked where it was sitting in the lane, where the front tires lined up under the light, and whether the driver was giving me anything through the windshield. The headlights were on. Good. It came all the way to the window. Good. The driver rolled it down before I even leaned toward the booth. Good. Nothing wrong with it, nothing unusual, just a normal crossing. But I realized after the fact that I had started reading the approach against Walter's rules without thinking about it. That was new. Sadie noticed too, I think, not because she said anything. She didn't. But I saw the quick look she gave me after the truck rolled through and the barrier arm came back down. It wasn't approval exactly, more like recognition. I was starting to do what the place asked of me, instead of holding myself apart from it. The fog stayed low the rest of the night, and every time I walked past the ramp after that, I could feel the pull to look underneath it. Once you hear a sound from a place like that, your body remembers it faster than your mind wants to. Still, I didn't look. I didn't need to prove anything to myself. The rule had worked once, and for that night, once was enough. That was the first small win I'd had in a long time that felt like it belonged to me. I hadn't beaten anything. I just followed a process under pressure, and for once, it held. By the last run of the shift, I wasn't just memorizing Walter's rules anymore. I was fitting them into the landing itself. Bell, booth, lane, logbook, floodlights, ramp, water level, approach, timing, first contact, final call. It all started feeling less like 5 strange instructions and more like one operating system laid over the top of another. That was where I got it wrong. By the end of night 2, I was afraid of the wrong things in the right way, and that made me feel sharper, smarter, more prepared. I wasn't brushing the place off anymore. I was starting to learn it, where to stand, when not to move, what not to look at, how long to wait, what mattered first. And because the rules had worked again, clean and exact, I started to believe that maybe this place could be handled the same way anything else could be handled. Maybe not easily, maybe not comfortably, but handled. The part of the second night that stayed with me happened in the booth. The heater kept clicking on and off under the counter, and the logbook was open between me and the glass. By then, I thought I had some kind of handle on the place, not on all of it, but enough to get through a shift if I stayed exact. We were close to the last crossing when the road went quiet again. The kind of quiet that feels bigger once you've already had enough traffic to get used to the normal sounds. No engines, no tires over damp pavement, no radio chatter except a quick burst of static that didn't resolve into anything. Even the water sounded flatter by then. The fog was still hanging low over the edge of the slip, not thick enough to shut us down, just enough to make the waterline look unfinished. Sadie was at the far end of the booth counter checking the change tray. I was doing what I'd started doing every time there was a pause, which was going over the rules in my head without meaning to. Bell, lane, window, floodlights, count, logbook, ramp. I didn't hear the person come up the road. That bothered me later. That place wasn't loud, but it wasn't silent either. Wet boards carry steps, gravel shifts. Somebody coughing out in the cold can sound closer than they are. Most people make some kind of sound without meaning to. This one was just there when I looked up. A man stood outside the booth window, close enough that I should have heard him approach. Mid-height, dark jacket, no hat. His face sat in the wrong part of the light, not hidden exactly, just never fully clear. He didn't lean in, didn't knock. He was just standing there with one hand down at his side and the other not visible from where I was. For half a second I thought he'd been there longer than I realized. Then he spoke. He said he'd missed the last crossing. Nothing dramatic in how he said it. That was part of what got to me. It was an ordinary complaint in an ordinary voice, like he was expecting me to look at the schedule, sigh, and decide whether I felt like helping him out. And just like that, Rule 4 came up in my head so clean, it felt practiced. If a passenger says they missed the last crossing, check the logbook before you answer. I did. That part happened fast, faster than the first time I'd used any of them. I reached for the book, flipped it open to the current page, and put my finger on the last few entries so I wouldn't lose my place. His name was already there, not scribbled off in the margin, not half written, not something close enough that I could tell myself I'd misread it because I was tired. It was there in a clean line on the page with enough room around it to make it worse. A name I knew for a fact I had not written. For a second, I just stared at it. Then I checked the page again. I didn't write this. The second the words were out, I wished I hadn't said them out loud. Not because I thought the man outside would hear more than the words themselves, just because speaking it made the whole thing feel less manageable. As long as it stayed in my head, it was still possible to call it a mistake. A skipped line. Some note Walter had put there earlier that I hadn't noticed. Something physical. Something boring. Sadie crossed the booth in 2 steps and looked down at the page without crowding me. She didn't take the book, didn't touch it, just looked. Sadie looked at the book, then away. Doesn't matter. I looked from the page to her, then back at the window. The man was still standing there, not impatient, not irritated. He wasn't tapping the frame or shifting his weight or glancing past me toward the ramp the way most people would if they thought they still had a chance of getting on. He was just waiting, like this part of the process always took a second. So what does? I asked. She took a second before answering. Closing it. That answer did more to unsettle me than the name on the page, because it meant she'd moved past surprise a long time ago. I shut the logbook. Then I did exactly what the rule said. I told him the ferry was out of service. Even then, even with the page closed under my hand and the words said, I still expected the same thing I'd gotten from the car the night before and the knocking under the ramp earlier that night. I expected some kind of shift, some clean sign that the rule had done what it was supposed to do. Maybe he'd turn and walk off. Maybe the tension in the booth would let go a little. Maybe the road outside would look normal again. Instead, the man just stood there another second, not a long second, but long enough. Then he nodded once, not annoyed, not disappointed, just a small motion like I'd confirmed something for him. And when he turned away, the first thing that hit me was the sound, or really the lack of the right sound. There should have been steps on wet boards, then maybe on pavement, maybe gravel once he got farther off. Some rhythm of a man leaving a small landing after being told he was stuck there for the night. I heard movement, but it came wrong. Too even. Too little difference from one surface to the next. Not soft exactly, just not matching the ground I knew was out there. I waited a beat too long before looking up. That was my mistake, not a big one, not enough to break the rule. But enough that when I lifted my eyes to the window, the space outside it didn't look right. He should have still been in reach of the outer light. There was no reason for him not to be. He hadn't moved fast. He hadn't hurried. And the road off the landing was open enough that I should have caught some piece of him leaving it. Instead, there was just the lane, the dull shine of moisture on the boards, and the weak yellow light giving up a few feet past the barrier. It was empty in a way that didn't feel right. At the time, that was all I had for it. I stood there with one hand still on the closed logbook. Sadie didn't go to the window. That stuck with me too. The first night, after the pedestrian with the dry shoes, she'd kept her eyes off the landing because the rule told her to. This time she didn't need a rule in front of her. She just stayed back from the glass and listened. Neither of us said anything for a while. The heater clicked once under the counter. Somewhere outside, a line knocked soft against a post. The radio gave a short burst of static and went dead again. I wanted to reopen the logbook. That was the part I had to fight. Not because I thought the name would be gone. I didn't. It was because I wanted another look at the page for the same reason people keep touching a bruise. You tell yourself you're checking it, but really you're trying to understand it by forcing contact with it again. I didn't open it. That was the rule, and I followed it. But for the first time since I'd gotten there, doing the right thing didn't make anything feel right after. The man had not argued. Good. He had turned away. Good. He had not boarded. Good. All the important parts, technically, had worked. And still, I didn't feel that small settling off I'd felt after the car stayed in the dark, or after the knocking stopped under the floodlights. The air in the booth stayed wrong. The book under my hand felt heavier than paper should. Even the lane outside looked flatter than it had a few minutes earlier, as if the landing had lost some piece of ordinary depth while I wasn't paying attention. That was where the crack started. Not in the rule itself. The rule still held. I did what it said, and the man did not get on the ferry. The crack was in what I thought the rules gave back when you followed them. Up until then, I had started to believe they restored order. You do the right thing, the problem passes, the night resets. That was the shape I had been building in my head because I needed one. Because I wanted one. Because once you've made one mistake big enough to ruin a job, any system that seems to reward precision starts to feel like a rope you can pull yourself up with. But standing there in that little booth with the logbook shut and my hand still resting on it, I understood something had shifted, even if I couldn't have said what yet. The rule had worked. The feeling hadn't. And when the next crossing time came around, I still ran the booth, checked the lane, watched the ramp, and logged the trip exactly like I was supposed to. I did all of it right. That part didn't change. What changed was that I no longer felt like the place had settled just because I had. I went into the third night already tired in a way sleep hadn't fixed. Not physically. I could still do the job. I could still run the panel, watch the lane, log the crossings, keep the timing straight in my head. It was the other kind of tired. The kind that comes from spending too long telling yourself a place makes sense and then catching it slip half an inch sideways when you're not ready for it. The road out to Back Ferry looked different that night, or maybe I was just seeing it different by then. Same marsh, same dark road, Same low ground opening toward the sound. I checked the ramp, the panel, the floodlights, and the logbook as soon as I got there. Sadie was quieter too. Not scared, just tighter in the way people get when they've stopped expecting a shift to stay ordinary. The shift stayed mostly normal through the first part of the night. A couple of local vehicles, a truck with feed bags in the back, a short stretch with no traffic at all. The kind of hours that let your mind get too loose if you weren't careful. I kept filling that space by checking things that didn't need checking. Barrier switch, deck lights, watermarks on the piling, logbook, ramp angle. I kept moving my attention like I could keep ahead of the place if I never let my focus sit still. Then the SUV came down the road. It wasn't doing anything wrong. That was what got me. Headlights on, right speed, straight line coming in. No hesitation short of the booth, no dead stop in the dark like the car the first night. Nothing I could point to and say there. That's the problem. But the shape of it caught me anyway. Mid-size SUV, dark color. Same general height and weight as the one from the old line. Enough to hit the wrong part of my head before I had a chance to stop it. I didn't get a full flashback. It wasn't like that. It was smaller and worse. Just a few hard pieces coming back all at once. The glare off wet metal, the bad angle at the lip. A man pounding on glass from inside the cabin after the vehicle hit wrong. The sound of somebody yelling my name from behind me while I was still trying to decide if I'd really seen what I thought I'd seen. That was all it took. The SUV rolled up to the booth and stopped. Driver's side closest to us. I could make out two shapes inside, an adult in front, smaller figure in the passenger seat or maybe slightly behind it. Hard to tell with the reflection on the glass. The driver rolled the window down before I even stepped all the way forward. A man's voice, tired, flat. He asked if we were still running. Normal question, normal tone. I should have answered right away. I knew the schedule. I knew the lane. I knew the boat was good for the crossing. But I stood there one beat too long trying to see past the reflection, trying to place the outline of the smaller figure inside, trying not to hear that other man from that other night gasping and coughing river water back up on a ramp that wasn't even this one. Sadie looked at me. "You with me?" "Yeah," I said. I heard how unsteady I sounded. That was the first moment I understood I wasn't as clean as I'd been the night before. I gave the man the crossing time and looked at the tires as the SUV eased forward. I always looked at tires. Weight, line, spacing, position. That part used to calm me down. Numbers and angles. Something exact. But I checked the front wheels twice and still didn't trust my own eyes. I watched the approach to the ramp and felt my stomach tighten at a point in the process that should have been routine by then. The man in the SUV glanced at me once as he rolled ahead. Just a quick look, not accusing, not familiar, but it landed wrong anyway. There was a kid in the vehicle. I was sure of that now. Maybe 10, maybe younger. Just a shape in the low interior light, head turned toward the window. Nothing happened. That should have helped. It didn't. We loaded them clean. The ramp sat right. The crossing itself held together. No wrong sounds under the boards, no issue at the booth, no entry in the logbook that didn't belong there. Everything about it was ordinary except what it was doing to me. That was the cost of it, not panic, not some dramatic collapse, just the slow loss of clean procedure. Coming back in after that run, I checked the panel twice and still almost reached for the wrong switch. Not a dangerous mistake. I caught it before I touched anything. But I caught it because I was watching myself now instead of just doing the job. Once you start supervising your own hands like that, you're already behind. Later, when another vehicle came in, I found myself looking into the windshield too long instead of reading the lane first. Sadie had already checked the tires in position before I'd finished trying to get a look at the driver's face. I knew better than that. I knew it while I was doing it. That made it worse. The old accident had done that to me before. The order of things stopped feeling clean after that. See the lane, check the angle, confirm the stop, move when it's clean. That used to be one motion. After the accident, I had to force it back together every time. That place had started giving me that old split feeling again, not because the threat was standing in front of me wearing the exact shape of my past. It didn't have to. It only had to press close enough to it. Close enough that every ordinary thing started carrying the weight of the wrong memory. Sadie didn't ask me what had happened before I got there. She didn't need to. She'd already heard the wobble in my voice. She'd seen me freeze for half a second at the booth window. She'd watched me lose the lane because I was busy looking at the people inside the vehicle. That was the danger now. Not that I was scared. I'd already been scared. It was that fear had started getting into the order of things, and the whole system out there depended on order. The thing that finally broke it open happened less than an hour after that SUV left the landing. The fog had dropped lower again, not thick enough to shut us down, but low enough that the floodlights stopped feeling like light and started feeling like glare. They flattened the ramp and washed the wet steel white, and everything below that still stayed hidden. The water sounded closer too. Not louder. Closer. Like the dark under the boards had lifted toward us a little. I was already off my rhythm by then. That was part of it. Maybe most of it. I'd been checking myself too hard ever since the SUV, watching my own hands, repeating simple steps in my head before I did them. That kind of thing makes you slow in ways nobody sees right away. You still look functional. You're still moving, but you're not clean anymore. We had just brought the ferry back in and tied her off for the next crossing when I heard the knocking. Not 3 slow hits like the night before. This time it came in a short run. Knock, 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 knock. Then a pause. Then 2 more from farther under the ramp, or maybe deeper under it. I can't say that part for sure. The sound moved in a way sound shouldn't have moved under something fixed. I didn't crouch. I didn't go for my flashlight. I did it right. Sadie heard it too. She didn't even look at me. She just shifted back from the edge of the booth window the way she had the night before. I hit the floodlights and started counting, out loud, steady, same as before. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The knocking kept going, not louder, just still there. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It didn't stop. That was the moment the bottom dropped out for me. Not because something new had happened, because something old had happened wrong. The rule had worked the night before. Cleanly. I heard the knocking. I followed the steps. The knocking stopped. My brain had built a whole structure around that. Process, action, result. Same shape I'd trusted my whole working life. Same shape I'd been trying to get back after the accident. Now I was standing there having done the exact same thing, and the sound under the ramp just kept coming. Not hard, not frantic, almost patient. I remember how cold my hand felt on the switch plate. I remember hearing the knock under my own breathing and under the hum of the floodlights and under the water. I remember realizing that the count hadn't failed. Not completely. The sound had changed while I counted. It had pulled back some, gone thinner, more distant maybe, but it had not stopped. That mattered. If it had done nothing, maybe I would have broken in a different way. I might have called the whole thing fake or gone straight into panic. But that wasn't what happened. The rule still did something, just not enough. That was worse. I canceled the crossing. That part was simple, easy even. My hand knew where to go on the panel. My mouth knew what to say over the radio. But while I was doing it, I could feel the rest of it coming together in my head, whether I wanted it to or not. Walter. The way he'd written notes on the clipboard harder than he needed to, like pressing down could make them stick better. The way he kept times tighter than the route really needed. The way he didn't hand me the rules first. He handed me the system first. Ramp, lane, light, water, booth, order, then the rules. Like one only meant something inside the other. And Sadie, not scared, not surprised, just used to it. Most nights that's enough. Not always. Most. I shut off the radio and stood there listening to the last of the knocking fade farther back under the ramp. Not gone, just farther. Then I looked at the logbook. I don't know why I did that right then. Maybe because Rule 3 had just failed cleanly, and my head went to the next thing on the page that had ever made me feel the same kind of wrong. Maybe because once the pattern starts breaking, you start checking the pieces of it. Whatever the reason, I reached for the book and opened it to the current page. There was another name there. Not one from earlier in the night. Not one I had missed. A new one. A name written lower on the page where there had been blank space less than 10 minutes before. I knew that because I'd looked at that same stretch of paper when I logged the canceled crossing. This time I didn't say anything out loud right away. I just stared at it and felt something in me go cold in a way fear alone doesn't do. It didn't hit me like panic. It was colder than that. The whole booth just felt tighter all at once, because that was when it stopped being 5 strange rules and became one complete shape. Rule 1 wasn't about manners. It wasn't about being cautious with late pedestrians. It was about not looking at a face that wanted to be recognized. If you looked the wrong thing in the face, maybe that was enough for it to cross some line the rest of you hadn't agreed to. Shoes first. Wet boards, dry soles. If the crossing didn't touch them the right way, then they weren't crossing the right way. Rule 2 wasn't about suspicious drivers. It was about response. If a car wanted the crossing, it had to answer the crossing like a real person would. Window down, human exchange. A thing that stays shut up in the dark and waits to be waved through doesn't get to come forward. Rule 3 wasn't protection. It was a delay. That was why the count worked the first time and only half worked now. 10 seconds wasn't some magic fix. It was a window. Time bought. Enough for whatever was under there to pull back if it still could. Not enough if it had already gotten farther than that. Rule 4 was the one that turned hardest in my head. The logbook wasn't recording passengers. Not really. It was recording attempts, openings, names attached to moments where something had come to the landing asking to be let across. That was why the name could be there before I wrote it. Because the book was keeping a different kind of count than I was. And Rule 5. Rule 5 was never about weight the way I had first wanted it to be. It wasn't some rough local way of checking for load shift or balance or a bad deck read. It was the real rule, the one under the others, the one that explained the rest. If the ferry comes back lighter than it left, do not drop the ramp right away, not because the ferry might be unsafe, because something might still be on it. I finally heard myself say it. These weren't to keep us safe, I said. Sadie didn't answer right away. That was what bothered me. If she'd argued, I think I could have pushed back against it a little longer. If she'd said I was overthinking it, or that Walter had just been cautious, or that I needed to settle down and finish the shift, I might have stayed in the smaller version of it a little longer. But she didn't. She just stood there with one hand on the counter and her eyes fixed somewhere past the window like she was looking at the lane without really seeing it. And that was when Walter got worse in my head. Not because he had lied. He hadn't. Every rule he gave me was real. Every step mattered. He'd stayed on that landing long enough to grow old in it because he had followed them hard enough and clean enough to buy himself one night after another. That was what made him frightening. He knew the rules worked. He knew they worked only inside a limit. And he kept carrying nights anyway. When she finally spoke, her voice stayed flat. They keep it from getting off clean. That line hit me harder than anything else had. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. It was work language. Clean approach, clean docking, clean transfer, clean crossing. And suddenly, the whole place felt built around one ugly fact. Nothing out there was being kept away completely. The landing wasn't safe. The ferry wasn't safe. Nobody working it was being protected in any full sense of the word. The rules were just there to keep the thing from making a clean crossing, to slow it down, to break its rhythm, to make it come in crooked, partial, unfinished. That was what I had misunderstood. I thought following the rules restored order. What they really did was reduce damage. That was why the first car never came forward. That was why the knocking backed off. That was why the man at the booth turned away. Not because the rules solved anything, because the rules denied it the easiest path through. And standing there with the logbook open and the floodlights still bleaching the ramp outside, I understood that my whole sense of safety over the first 2 nights had been built on the wrong promise. The rules were not a way to get through back Ferry untouched. They were just a way to still be there by morning, if that was still on the table. The last run of night 3 went out light on traffic and heavy on everything else. No vehicles waiting at the lane, no one at the booth. Just black water under the weak dock lights and the ferry pushing off into Pamlico Sound with that same low engine vibration I'd already learned to read through my boots. Sadie stayed in her spot near the window at first, but neither of us was pretending the shift still belonged to the same system it had belonged to an hour earlier. I took the crossing because that was the job. That was the part Walter would have done. You keep the route moving unless the rule tells you not to. You don't start inventing new procedures just because you finally understand how ugly the old ones are. Halfway across, nothing looked wrong. That was what made it worse. The deck stayed steady. The rail lights held. The dark on both sides of the boat looked like the same dark it had been all night. No sound under the boards, no figure at the far end of the deck, no reason for the skin on the back of my neck to stay tight the whole time. I made the far landing, held the approach, and brought the ferry back the way I was supposed to. It felt wrong before I even had words for it. Not much. Not enough that somebody new would have caught it. But I'd had 2 nights of this place in me by then, and I knew the weight of an empty return, the weight of a loaded one, the small differences in how the deck answered the slip when the lane was clear and the ferry had only itself on it. This one came back lighter than it had left. The second I knew that, everything in me wanted to move fast. That old reflex came back hard. Fix it early. Correct it before it turns into a real mistake. Get ahead of the thing that feels wrong. That was the same piece of me that had ruined my old job. The piece that always believed one quick, decisive move was better than a pause, better than waiting, better than looking stupid for a few extra seconds. I brought the ferry in and kept the ramp up. The engine was still humming under me. My hand was already moving for the panel when I remembered the rule, not as words on Walter's folded sheet anymore, but as the only thing left between the landing and whatever had come back with me. Keep it raised. Kill the engine. Wait 1 full minute. So I killed the engine. Just like that, the whole landing went quieter, not silent. Nothing around water ever is. There was still the soft knock of current under the slip, a line shifting against metal, the little settling sounds a ferry makes when the engine gives up its vibration and the weight of it turns still. But the human part of the noise was gone, and that made every other sound feel closer. I looked at the clock on the panel. 1 minute. That was all I had to do. That was all Walter had ever really been handing off. Not courage, not certainty, just enough discipline to hold the exact wrong movement back for 60 seconds. I heard Sadie step out of the booth behind me. I didn't turn. The first footsteps came from the deck above. Slow, solid, moving forward, not a scramble, not a rush. Just the sound of something crossing the steel toward the ramp before anybody should have been able to step off. Every muscle in me pulled toward the controls. If you've never made a mistake like the one I made years earlier, it's hard to explain what happens inside you when a situation starts to rhyme with it. It isn't just fear, it's a need, a physical need to intervene before the shape completes itself, before another vehicle goes wrong, before another person looks at you with that exact second of trust they shouldn't have given you. The footsteps came again. 1 set, then maybe not 1 set. I couldn't tell. The sound shifted strangely across the deck, like it was crossing one surface and more than one distance at the same time. I kept my eyes on the clock because I knew if I looked up too soon, I might do something with what I saw. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Sadie move 1/2 step closer than she should have. Sadie kept her eyes on the ramp. "Don't drop it." I didn't answer. I just watched the clock run down. That line between instinct and rule got real thin right there. Because the ugliest part of it was this. Holding the ramp up did not feel like protecting anybody. It felt like failing to act. It felt like standing there and letting something develop on the far side of your own hands. Every bad operator story I'd ever heard came down to some version of hesitation or assumption. Move too soon and you ruin people. Wait too long and you ruin people. That was always the balance, but this wasn't balance anymore. This was choosing which kind of damage you were willing to allow. The footsteps reached the section of deck closest to the ramp, then stopped. I still didn't look up. I thought about the SUV from my old line, about the angle of the ramp that night, about how badly I had wanted the situation to still be normal even as it slipped away from me. I thought about the father inside that vehicle, about how long it took to get him out, about how nothing in any report afterward changed the fact that I had been the one who made the move that let the rest of it happen. And I knew, as clearly as I've ever known anything, that if I dropped the ramp early now, I would be doing the same thing again. Not the same job, not the same water, not even the same kind of wrong, but the same act. I would be the man who let it through. That was the choice. Not whether the rule would save me. Not whether Sadie and I would walk away untouched if I did everything right. That idea was dead already. The choice was smaller and meaner than that. Would I be the one who opened the path or not? The clock kept moving. The footsteps started again, this time not coming forward so much as shifting across the deck in a line that didn't match where the rail or the ramp should have guided them. That almost broke me. The need to turn, to look, to confirm what was there with my own eyes got so strong I felt it in my teeth. But I kept looking at the panel. A few seconds before the minute finished, something struck the inside of the raised ramp once. Not hard, just enough to tell me whatever was up there had reached the edge and met the one thing still holding. Then nothing. The minute ran out. I waited one breath longer than I had to, not because the rule said so, but because I didn't trust myself yet. Then I lowered the ramp. Clean, empty, wet steel under the lights, no person standing there, no shadow moving off the deck, no shape in the lane waiting for me. Just the landing, the slip, and the cold black water beyond the rail like the whole place had spent a minute holding itself tight. Sadie still hadn't moved. When I finally looked at her, she looked smaller somehow. Not physically, just quieter. Like the night had taken something off her without needing to touch her. We finished what was left of the shift because that was what there was to do. I logged the crossing, I checked the lane, I reset the panel. I wrote with a steadier hand than I felt. Nothing else dramatic happened before dawn. The sky started losing its black edge by degrees, and the marsh came back in flat strips of gray. The road out stopped looking endless. The booth just looked old again. The landing just looked wet and tired and real. That almost made it worse, because morning didn't prove anything had passed. It just proved morning had arrived. I didn't quit the next day. I thought about it on the drive back in, thought about throwing the folded sheet back at Walter if I saw him, thought about leaving Hyde County altogether and taking whatever work I could find farther inland where nothing crossed black water at night and came back wrong. But that wasn't peace talking me into staying. It was the opposite. I stayed because I finally understood what Walter had been carrying, and because once you understand that, walking away doesn't feel clean anymore either. Back Ferry was still there. The lane was still there. The booth, the bell, the floodlights, the logbook, the ramp, all of it was still there, waiting for the next night to ask the same things again. The rules weren't promises. They weren't there to keep anybody whole. They just made it harder for whatever came to that landing to get across clean. That was all Walter had been holding back for all those years. By then, I understood that all could still matter.